Big, huge greetings out to everyone out there on Zoom. Aroha, my apologies that we've had to go online today. We've got a few people with COVID in amongst the mix, and we've got a few people outside of Tamaki Makaurau. So we've decided that this is the safest way to go for all of the whānau today. I wish you a warm welcome to this amazing Tōmai Ora session. We're really lucky today that we've got two amazing doctoral candidates. One has been awarded with her doctorate and one is soon to be awarded, has just passed her oral examination, who are going to be presenting their amazing Indigenous research projects to us. So we've got the fabulous Dr Debbie Goodwin there, or Dr Debbie Waireka, who has undertaken Kaupapa Māori research looking at evaluation frameworks for co-design research with Māori. And then we've got the soon-to-be Dr. Rachel Tapera, who looked at Indigenous Ubuntu approaches for working with Indigenous African migrants and their experiences with neurodiversity. So look, I'm not going to hold the reins much longer because I'm really excited to hear from these two amazing wahine toa and what they've got to share with us. We're going to have Debbie present first, followed by Rachel, and then some Q&A. So Debbie, e hoa, would you like to share your screen and take it away?
Oh, kia ora koutou. I'm just going to try and share my screen.
We can see that, Debbie, but it's got your notes on the side. Ka pai. Oh, now we've got your notes pages.
Maybe that?
Yep, perfect. Here we are. Ka pai.
Okay. Ko te mea tuatahi, he hōnore, he karorea ki te atua, he maunga rongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. E ngā kaiwhakahaere, tēnā koutou mō tō tautoko kia hau. E ngā rangatira mā, ngā tauira o te kupenga Hauora Māori, me te waipapa taumata rau, tēnei te mihi nunui ki a koutou. Tēnō hari koa taku nākau ki te taimai ki tēnei hui, ki te kōrero e pāna i taku mahi rangahau. Kia hau, he koha iti, hoia no ko te tūmanako au e whakapakari ana te mahi aromatawai ki te oranga o ngā whānau apu iwi hoki. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora everyone, thanks for coming today. I'm really excited to share a little bit about my PhD journey, creating space for meaningful evaluation, development of a Kaupapa Māori evaluation framework for evaluating co-design projects with Māori. Ki te taha o tōku pāpa no tūhoe no Whakatōhea, ki te taha o tōku māma no tangata tiriti no Ingarangi, ko Debbie Tuhi Waireka Tuhi Goodwin tōku ingoa. I firstly would like to acknowledge my supervisors, Dr. Donna Cormack from the University of Auckland, but I also had two from other universities, Dr. Lisa Te Moringa from Massey University and Dr. Bridget Masters Aotearoa from the University of Waikato that supported me through this journey. And I also wanted to acknowledge and let you know that I'm not a Kaupapa Māori expert or an expert in te reo or tikanga. I am in the space of learning my reo and developing my understanding around tikanga. So a key focus of my research was to deepen my understanding of Kaupapa Māori evaluation. I work as an independent evaluator and have done since 2007. And I had not been in academia since about 2005. So I'd been out of academia for a long, long time. But that was my first and foremost focus. It was around understanding Kaupapa Māori evaluation, where it had got to in academia, but also to provide a critique of co-design processes and to develop something practical and useful for Māori organisations and communities. So as I was doing this, I was able to get a scholarship with the Healthier Lives He Oranga Hauora National Science Project, and that was a co-designed project, which is of great interest to me in terms of working together with others. So that's where I came into I guess the space of co-design. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, there was a burgeoning interest, and there still is, in the use of co-design in developing interventions and programs and improving and innovating services, particularly in the government and health sectors. A number of issues were being reported in the literature and also from my own experience as an evaluator. There were largely Eurocentric use of co-design and co-design methodologies. Sometimes there's poor co-design practices being reported and a lack of true participation and partnership. There was a lack of evaluation of co-design processes, particularly with Indigenous peoples. So the co-design literature also identified other things that the literature review that I did around the ambiguous nature of partnerships and participation in co-design, and the need to understand the benefits of co-design, particularly for Indigenous populations. I critically reflected on the importance of the non-Māori partners like governments, government ministries and philanthropy, and the need to reflect on their roles within the co-design processes. And of course, a further aim of my research was really to do something practical and useful for Māori organisations and communities. So that's where I thought about creating these evaluation tools that we could use by Māori, with the aim of supporting Māori to assess co-design processes and using Māori principles and criteria. And that's just a kind of a list of my the mahi that I did over the 3 years. Oh, actually, it was more than that. I used a Kaupapa Māori approach, research and evaluation undertaken by Māori for Māori, recognises the importance of Māori language and culture, and takes a critical perspective of colonisation and its impacts on Māori. And it seeks to promote Māori development and transformation, and legitimises our Māori worldviews. And I had a number of other approaches that in the evaluation field that aligned with that, like empowerment evaluation, transformative evaluation, and participatory community-based evaluation. So as I said before, the context of the research was in the Healthier Lives He Oranga Hauora National Science Challenge, and it was actually with the Ola Ora project, which was a co-designed project. And this was working with Māori communities like Waireka and Ngāti Whātua and Toi Tangata, a national Māori agency which specialises in healthy living and healthy learning based on mātauranga Māori. So these were some of the Māori organisations involved in the co-design of this particular tool, which became an app. It wasn't necessarily going to be an app. It was just decided during the co-design that that's what would be most useful. So throughout my PhD journey, I was navigating two different worldviews and acknowledging and thinking about the distinctness and the differences and what that means for my research. Where does co-design and evaluation come from? What is a Māori view of co-design? And how does that worldview differ to the Eurocentric Western worldview? What is the impact of that on co-design? The He Awa Whiria Braided Rivers framework that was developed by Professor Angus McFarlane helped me realise, I needed to map out the different sources and the different knowledge bases, and that's what I was doing here. And what I think I learned the most really was the need to emphasise the distinct knowledge bases that are drawn from Te Ao Māori and Te Ao Pākehā. And it's not rocket science, but it's something that I think I really learnt is important, to draw out the distinct natures that they come from, and that they are very different from each other, and they're different ways of seeing the world and being in the world. Some of the views from the people that I interviewed that I've put up here kind of reflect some of those. In my own experience of living in two worlds, I have a Pākehā side and I have a Māori side to my whānau, and they are quite different families and whānau. And at this time, I was also reminded by an esteemed colleague, Fiona Cram, of the real possibility of epistemological racism, discrimination that occurs against a particular worldview, often marginalised and often our own Māori worldviews. So yet our whakaaro and our concept and principles are what we look to and value in our mahi, including our co-design mahi. This creates space for our own ways of being and are drawn from mātauranga Māori and tikanga Māori. And here's a couple of whakatōhea that I've used in reflecting on co-design, but I'll actually move on because I don't have a lot of time. So looking to what is kaupapa Māori evaluation and what are kaupapa Māori evaluation ways of working and frameworks. The systematic literature review that I undertook I looked at kaupapa Māori evaluation, health evaluations, and that particularly the methodologies that were used, and came up with these key themes that describe kaupapa Māori evaluation and how they were used over probably a period of 20 years and only in a number of texts, so a number of papers or theses actually. These core concepts would just demonstrate and describe how kaupapa Māori evaluation was being undertaken up until recently, but also as early as the 2000s. And I found this interesting because I was new to the space of academia and kind of all the literature that was out there. I also undertook interviews with 9 evaluation leaders who use kaupapa Māori evaluation, and identified these 12 key features of kaupapa Māori evaluation practice and also of kaupapa Māori frameworks. So these were identified from their kōrero, and they also reflect very closely with the earlier 7 themes that were identified from the literature, but they're based in the praxis of evaluation rather than just necessarily what I took from a paper, a written paper. So this was digging a bit more deeply into how evaluators, kaupapa Māori evaluation is practiced. Some of the things here you can see were similar, like our mātauranga Māori, ngā hononga, our relationships, mahitahi working together, whakamana, focusing on strength-based approaches, those sorts of things. Tuku te ringa aroha, capacity building approaches. And I'm running out of time. So going to the development of the framework, I took the learnings from the way that we are doing kaupapa Māori evaluation and the way that I work, really, that it reflected the way that I work as well, to collaboratively develop a framework. The development of this framework came from the in-depth kōrero and whakaaro shared from Toi Tangata STAR, resulting in criteria for good co-design as and with Māori, inquiring about what would a tool look like and what is a Māori perspective of good co-design processes. To be useful, it needed to be an easy to use team assessment tool, possibly an online tool, which it isn't at the moment, and which takes the rōpū through a reflective process. So from this, a range of tools, I tested a range of tools. They got simpler in version as I adapted them. So they included an online survey to start with, and then it got adapted into a workbook for collective kōrero approaches, and using reflective processes, rating scales, and pūrākau or kōrero paki. The Te Whetū tool basically are concepts or connects 6 tikanga principles around what good looks like in co-design processes from a Māori perspective. So this came out of the kōrero and is kind of the basis of the framework, I guess you could say. So tino rangatiratanga, for example, is a key principle that was important in the evaluation of co-design with Māori and provides reflection and discussion for understanding the extent to which tino rangatiratanga for Māori communities was part of co-designing with Māori. So this model promotes government partners supporting tino rangatiratanga and Māori aspirations as part of a co-design process. The hononga principle is the need for partnerships based on trust, respect, reciprocity, and shared decision-making and understanding of others' perspectives. That open and honest dialogue and that have previously been identified in the literature. So I did go back through the literature and kind of looked at all of these principles and where others had brought this kōrero out in other literature as well. I'm nearly finished. Towards the end of my PhD journey, I drew on the example of tukutuku as a metaphor for co-design. So in practice, we are working together, tuku meaning to release, let go, or pass. We're passing through to those on the opposite side, as you can see here in this picture. And thinking about how co-design can be in that closeness, there's laughter, kōrero, expertise, mentoring, sharing, there's design happening, there's time, a lot of time that is spent together in this type of mahi. And so remembering that as Māori, the process and experience is the important thing, or is often more important than the outcome, is that actual process. This was the end result of that tukutuku. Our nanny's doing that tukutuku, and it sits in the Māori Presbyterian Church in Whakatane. I've used this design symbolism from our mātauranga Māori to visualise the Kaupapa Māori evaluation framework in its entirety. So I chose the tukutuku panels as a symbol of Kaupapa Māori evaluation. And the evaluation tools that I developed and tested through the PhD. It represents the evaluation story that needs to be told through a Māori frame or worldview. Each tool can be used in different ways, and together they create an overall design made up of a number of different designs. In this way, I propose in my thesis that Māori researchers, designers, and communities should lead co-design of services and programs that are relevant to Māori. A government agency might want a co-design and might provide the resource and impetus for co-designing, but should be in support of Māori leading or co-leading. And just to finish up, the weaving of the tukutuku also acknowledges all the strands of knowledge shared that contributed to my PhD journey, and it was many people's kōrero that came together. So I used this e hara takitoa I te toa takitahi, engari he toa takitini as a whakatōhea from the very beginning of my journey, but acknowledging that it is not really my own, it was all of us together. Kia ora, that's me.
Nā mihi nui ki a koe, Debbie, e te wahine toa. That was an amazing kōrero. We've already got some pātai in the chat, but what we'll do is we'll leave the pātai, I think, until the end of both sessions and then have it here. It's always hard to ask for paki via Zoom, but maybe with emotions or in person. Kia ora e hoa. It now gives me pleasure to present our second presenter, the soon-to-be Dr. Rachel Tapera. Rachel, take it away.
Kia ora. Thanks, Anika. Tēnā koe e te whare, no timuawe, marawi, mohapiki, hoki o ki tupuna. Nā reira, ko te mani te maunga, ko ozi te awa, ko shona te matawaka, ko pendeke te tupuna, ko Mukwezwa, tōku whānau, No harare aho, ko Rachel Mukwezwa Tapera toku ingoa. No reira, tena koto, tena koto, tena koto kato. Kia ora, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome. Thanks, Debbie, for opening up. It's going to be difficult to come after your amazing research. So my name is Rachel. I just completed my doctoral. And today I'll be sharing with you part of the work that I've done towards the accomplishment of that qualification. So I'm originally from Zimbabwe, but my ancestors come from Mozambique, Malawi, and South Africa. So I'll really be focusing mainly on the methodology part of my research. Before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge the people who have made this project a success. First of all, to just extend my heartfelt gratitude to Tangata Whenua and Mana Whenua for hosting me on this land. And secondly, to the participants who let me into their lives, sharing their narratives, without which we wouldn't be having this research to even talk about. To the research advisory group and several community leaders for their mentorship and guidance. To my supervisors, to the Tumuaki and my colleagues from Tekupenga Hauora Māori, thank you. Last but not least, to my family and friends who have supported me spiritually, emotionally, financially, and in many more ways that perhaps I cannot thank them enough. So yes, I'm just putting up this slide to just highlight some of the key terms that I'll continuously be referring to. The first one being neurodivergence, which refers to the differences or the variety in the wiring of our brains in a population. And then the second one would be Indigenous African migrants. This refers to a fairly small population in New Zealand. This is a collective of culturally, linguistically, and religiously diverse people whose ancestors originate from the motherland. Okay, so these were the research questions that I set out to try and answer. There was quite a lot that I could have included, but then to fit the scope of the doctoral study, I had to first of all look at the factors that influence the lived realities of neurodivergent Indigenous African migrants in New Zealand, and also factors that impact their participation and their access to services. The third part was to explore whether migration has an impact on African indigeneity, and then lastly was to seek recommendations that could at least contribute to the betterment of these people's experiences. So how could this research be carried out safely? So when we look at the research questions, and also from the literature review and the consultations that I made with the Indigenous African communities in New Zealand, it was evident that there were so many gaps that needed to be addressed. But also there was quite a lot of, it was a sort of a complex space to explore. So when neurodivergence, migration, and indigeneity come together, the nexus is something that needed to be navigated carefully. So this is where I needed to develop a robust methodology that could account for the several factors that sort of impacted the experiences of African people. So first of all, looking at the pre-migration and post-migration factors and how those impacted the experiences of people with neurodivergence, but also realizing that we are in a land that belongs to other Indigenous people, where we need to also be mindful of Tangata Whenua, ensuring that we don't impose the same harms that Western research imposed on Tangata Whenua. We also needed to recognize and privilege Indigenous African ways of knowing, and also ensuring that the research was also culturally safe, because African people also went through a history of very difficult research experiences through the processes of colonization. And lastly, it was also important to ensure that the research was relevant and applicable to inform policy and future research, not just in Aotearoa, but across the world as well. So before I talk about the overarching philosophy of this research, I wanted to bring to your attention some of the reasons why I was encouraged to conceptualize this research methodology and applying an African philosophy. So I think the most significant contributor to most of my thinking was my exposure to Kaupapa Māori through my research and teaching. I think just getting to realize that I think it was always knowing that colonization has its impacts and we continue to suffer those impacts. But then how can we question, some of the challenges that we face? So I think this is when I just started to learn about indigenous theories, learning about decolonial work. And then I think that was the game changer, just knowing that there's a way that we can question the inequities that we see, and that, that is a space where perhaps this research could fit as well, because I was working with African communities who themselves had their own histories with colonization. I think my own journey as well, as I was exploring my own identity and my own indigeneity, also informed my decision to work with this methodology. The lack of bicultural approaches in Aotearoa was also very concerning to me. So we understand that Aotearoa is sort of built on tiriti, where the Crown and Tangata Whenua sort of signed an agreement. But then when we look at all the structures in this country, there's a lack in those bicultural lenses to everything. I think most of the stuff is Western. So now when you think that, when you think about the invisibility of Tangata Whenua, then you also question the invisibility as well of other smaller populations that fall under the Crown. And then lastly, of course, the need for safe research where African families felt comfortable to participate. So after pondering and wondering how else to do this research, the African philosophy of Ubuntu was the most fitting foundation for this research. Please note that as much as I refer to African people as a collective, they are very different people with different religions, different ways of knowing. But when we look at the philosophy of Ubuntu, it's something that sort of crosses over across our many communities, our many ethnic groups, our many tribes. So Ubuntu is an ethical theory that is familiar across African society. It is a philosophy of becoming human and an expression of our everyday living. So Ubuntu stipulates that we are who we are because of who is around us. So we understand our own identities only in relationship to others. The concept of Ubuntu also correlates strongly with the Indigenous Holism framework by Absalon, which stipulates that our relationships and our connections influence our realities and experiences. Ubuntu can also be applied as a robust moral system that can be applied to social justice frameworks or as a decolonizing framework. It also provides a space to enable alternative theorizing and address inequities, something that I thought really worked well in this research. So where Ubuntu is present, isolation, marginalization, and racial discrimination diminish, whilst a sense of belonging and flourishing in communities increases. So the next slide here just shows just a few of the places where the spirit of Ubuntu sort of emerged in this research. So like I said, that Ubuntu is a way, like it's a sense of everyday living. Sometimes it's actually very difficult to document everywhere where Ubuntu was sort of emerging. But what we see in this slide are just some of the places where it was aligned. So when Sean Wilson writes about Indigenous methodologies, he says that it's all about relational accountability, or being accountable to one's own relations. So what we can see here is that as an Indigenous researcher, it was my role, or it is my role, to be accountable to all my relations. So be it the participants, the elders from the communities, the academia as well. So I think this is this methodology fitted in quite well in trying to ensure that relational accountability was well taken care of. So moving on again to explore the methodology a bit further. So when we understand the history of colonization and the legacies of Western research in Aotearoa and Africa, when we understand about the devaluation of indigenous knowledges, and also the many layers of imperial and colonial practices that underpin knowledge creation and their impact on systems and policies and people's lived realities, then you would understand why it is important to sort of look for paradigms in research that sort of privilege indigenous knowing. So to help me explain this methodology, I'll sort of relate to the basket weaving process. So the way that different paradigms or ways of knowing were brought together in this research can be likened to basket weaving, where we see different strands being brought together to end up with a final product. In this case, it's the new knowledge that came through this research. So in this basket weaving process, the philosophy of Ubuntu is illustrated by the skeleton of the basket, or the frame that holds everything together. We also see social constructionism coming in to provide the most suited theoretical lens to firmly locate this research, as it complemented the philosophy of Ubuntu. So I think one of the challenges in conceptualizing this methodology was to look for paradigms that sort of allowed the vastness of indigenous theorizing to come out without limiting them. When we look at most Western paradigms, there's a lot of restrictions, or there's a lot of philosophical underpinning that sort of opposes indigenous thinking. So it was it was a huge task trying to look for paradigms that complemented my work well. So yeah, social constructionism being a multidisciplinary paradigm that values social interactions and focuses on multiple interpretations of experiences within context seemed to be a good fit in my work. All right, so now we move on to look at the methods. So this was a fully qualitative research that started off with consultations from community elders, consultations with Maori experts and academics on guidance around indigenous theories and methodologies. Data collection was through semi-structured interviews with families of neurodivergent children, African migrant community leaders, and child health specialists. So I'll just touch briefly on the findings. So there were so many findings that I tried to condense into 4 themes. But when we look at the themes, well, as much as I tried to separate them, the themes are actually all interlinked together, like they're all interlaced. So I think Ubuntu and a sense of belonging came out really strongly. Positioning neurodivergence sort of referred to people's understandings or perceptions of neurodivergence. Part C really looked at the lived realities of these families, and then part D was an insight into the services and supports. Intersectionality was one of those overlapping, like overarching findings that I thought I would speak about today. So intersectionality further complicated the lived realities of neurodivergent African migrants and their families. Intersectionality recognizes that identity markers do not exist independently, and each informs the other. So often creating a convergence of oppression or discrimination or privilege in some cases. So this research found that the more identity markers somebody had, the more complex their experiences were. So we see that the impact of Black body racism came out strongly in this research and was evident in the experiences of almost all the families seeking services. So racial microaggressions, ethnic bias, and discrimination were everyday experiences amongst the participants that I met. So to sort of sum up my findings, I think what we see in the middle there are common experiences of almost every family. I think everybody expressed stress, challenges navigating the system, you know, all of these things. But then what we saw was that families who felt that they had adequate peer support, they felt they had a sense of belonging, they felt that they could persevere, or, you know, they were really hopeful that they had a brighter tomorrow with their children. You also had a really strong sense of Ubuntu in those spaces. For the few families perhaps who lived in isolation, who felt they didn't belong, often their experiences were not really good. So we see that where belongingness is felt, where so belongingness is a positive when for families who are experiencing the difficulties or all of those challenges that came about because of neurodivergence. We also saw that through this research that Ubuntu and other African ways of relationality were adapted in Aotearoa, and I think this also contributed to the positive experiences and the resilience that was reported by most families. So I think I have 1 minute left. I hope that will help me talk about the recommendations. So this research shows several significant gaps and issues that require attention to improve the experiences of neurodivergent Indigenous African migrants and their families. So there's a need for holistic and responsive services that are flexible enough to accommodate the population's diversity. So how can the current settings be improved? From this research, I think some of the recommended actions to help us attain the highest impact will be the highest impact to improve the lives of neurodivergent Indigenous African migrants and their families are highlighted in this slide. So to sum up these recommendations, I think that all these actions will be easier to implement if we have a conducive policy environment that honors Te Tiriti. I believe that if we have Tiriti at the center, and once this is done right, we will get it right for everybody. If as a country, if Aotearoa as a country were nailing perhaps the application of Tiriti or applying it as intended, then perhaps we wouldn't be struggling a lot with the inequities and the social injustice that we see in this country. So I guess this leads me to the end of my presentation with this quote from Desmond Tutu reiterating the philosophy of being human, the philosophy of belongingness. He says that my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. Thank you.
Kia ora, Rachel. Another fabulous presentation.